just a little bit of background about Queer Kernow, and worked in a county museum, Royal Cornwall Museum in Cornwall, and as a queer person I didn't really see there was much happening between the queer community and museums and heritage in Cornwall. So I started as an employee of RCM to try and fix that, and it all kind of started because we have over 500,000 objects in that museum and not one of them was tagged as LGBT. Even using some of the more historical and salacious language, which is usually my next go-to when searching a collection, nothing came up. And instantly that was a red flag of, well, okay, if no one's going to do this, someone should. So I set up Queer Kernow CIC to kind of tackle the problem Dutchy-wide. And yeah, we're an LGBTQ plus research project that works with museums and galleries around Cornwall, but I feel like it's also really important point to the success of this is I'm also a trustee of Cornwall Pride, and it's being able to bridge that gap between the community and the heritage industry, which is where I feel like Queer Kernow sits. It's neither fully heritage, it's neither fully community. Ideally, in my world, it bridges the gap and brings them together. So what I'm going to do is just take you through one project that I've been doing recently, and I think the reason Dan asked me to speak on it is because it's been funded by the Queer Heritage Collections Network, with some also a bit of funding from Kernow, which is the County Records Office where the project was held, and the Cornwall Museums Partnership, which is a partnership charity that supports and works with museums and galleries and archives in Cornwall. Okay, so the Outback newsletter is the project that I was working on. So it's 130 issues of a grassroots self-published newsletter for lesbians and women in the Cornwall and far southwest. It was published between 1996 and 2008, and when I approached Chloe, who is the education leader at Kernow, about doing a project with them, I was like, this whole collection was sat unaccessioned in their acquisition section, and it hadn't been looked at, it hadn't been itemized, nothing had really happened to it since it had been donated to the Archive Centre, and that's not really a criticism of them. I've worked in collections, I know how big the backlogs can be, but it did offer a really, really fun and excellent opportunity for me to, you know, I saw this collection and my brain just kind of exploded with ideas because, you know, nothing's been written about it, they've not been looked at, they've not been itemized out or even accessioned into the collection. So that was my kind of first port of call was, well, we need to get these accessioned and we need to get a bit of information about what they contain, and, you know, really go through them. So that's where the project Queering the Archive was born, really, with this collection. And I wanted to start with just this. This is just a really rough screen grab from my massive Excel spreadsheet. So what I've been doing with each individual issue, and there are 130 odd issues where it's odd because there are duplicates of some and we're missing a couple of others, is writing up kind of what they would want from an archival point of view in their CALM database. So it started off in the first few months very insular, very much me working with the archivists at Kernow, getting familiar with their CALM database and thinking, how can I record the data in these newsletters in a way that's going to be transferable into their practices, with the end result being that they have a fantastic online collection, and I wanted the information from these newsletters to be freely available afterwards. So it was really interesting to sit down with the archivist, and work out, okay, we need to come up with some tagging. We need to come up with, you know, do you want me to condition check them as I'm going? Do you want me to, you know, what are the themes that we want to highlight when we eventually do put them online? Because I think we've discovered there's so many themes that can be pulled out that it's worthy to have those as tags. And one thing that really helped actually was when we were having this discussion, I brought in a couple of my partners in the queer community to actually have a say on how it was tagged. And that was Matthew from Cornwall Pride, and also a couple of representatives from Transparent Presence, which is a trans and non-binary charity down in Cornwall, CIC, sorry, down in Cornwall. And I work really closely with those two groups because they are fantastic sensitivity readers. They're fantastic people to just have in the room when you're discussing these things. I think it's great to bring the community in on such a kind of granular early level, and they really felt included and as if they had a say in their own history. And the reason that I thought it important to bring them in at the point where we were discussing tagging is to talk about the issue around tagging when you have words that are not necessarily used now, but they're used in the source documents, and we don't want to tag it under that. So what is the kind of a right way to go about this? And I know there's a lot of chatting about and discussion over what's the right way to go, but I thought let's kind of get together and have a right way for Cornwall almost, or let's all discuss together so we're all happy in our little kind of rural isolated boot on the end of the UK. So I think that was really helpful, and we really got some interesting kind of discussion going about internal tagging within Queer Kernow. And what was fab is that even though it was sparked off by this project, by this Outback collection, it's something that the archive have been able to bring out in other areas. So I was really pleased that one of the outcomes of working with them is they now have an LGBTQ+ history collections guide on their website. And even though I haven't directly kind of helped in that, it was from the discussions around this whole tagging and archive and how we deal with it in the CALM database before it even gets to the public that has kind of led to the point where Chloe, the education leader at Queer Kernow, felt that they had enough guidance then to write a policy internally for changing that as a longevity kind of project for them internally. So I think that's been a really good legacy of this project, just from a very internal point of view. So I also just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the really interesting themes that we can pull out from the Outback magazines, because I think they're fantastic, and just really want to share them with you. So there's been, oh my gosh, I can't do maths, either 7 or 8 themes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 themes, I can count, sorry, from the Outback that are kind of important enough that we have kept them as an individual theme within Queer Kernow, like I was discussing, in their tagging systems, but important enough that it's something that when I'm looking through these 130 issues comes up again and again and again. So the first one is events, and I've put here some pictures just because the Outback magazine is amazing. And we've got here a garden fete, and this was a precursor to Pride. So before Pride had even reached down to Cornwall, because it was started in 2008 down in Cornwall, there used to be these kind of individually private run prides, little garden fetes, which was a really, you know, it has everything that a pride nowadays would have. They had drag shows, they had stalls and competitions and games and food and music, and I think that's really, it's nice to see when everyone says, oh, when, you know, Pride started in Cornwall in 2008, well, it did in a formal way, but there was community beforehand, and they were doing things and meeting up and having these fantastic events. So I've also put up a bit of information here about one of the Pinky's hotel events that was a disco put up, a drag queen disco. And what I really like is that, you know, it says that there are lockers there to leave your change of clothing. So it is that kind of hint that, you know, you'd come almost in your everyday drag to pass, and then you can get changed here and it's a safe space. And I think it's really interesting to pick up on those little event kind of points from history and in how the community was interacting with the local Cornish community at this point, and how safe did they feel, because a lot of the kind of events, it's things like, you know, don't go to this bar because the bartender on a Saturday will throw you out, or actually this coffee shop is really nice and you can go and hold hands and no one will make fun of you. And I think that says a lot of the times. So we're talking like 1996 in Cornwall. So I think it's fantastic to record those things, but also to really see what was going on. Without the Outback, we wouldn't know about Pinky's and the Sandwich Hotel. We wouldn't know about these garden fetes, and it's something that is fantastic that we now have this archive and we are writing down early events pre-2008, what was happening in Cornwall. So another facet that the Outback magazine had was a lot of support groups, a lot of switchboards, a lot of meetups, a lot of kind of, you know, social prescribing, almost getting together and having a chat and knowing where to go to ring up for any kind of advice. And the image on the right is the Cornwall Lesbian Line logo, and they were actually the ones that ended up funding the Outback so it wouldn't close and giving it that bit of support and kind of financial oomph over the years. And then you also on the reverse cover of every single Outback, it had advice, helplines and information and places to go. And as well as having these kind of, you know, switchboards and women's groups and organisations you can find, there were also things like here are some gay-friendly removal companies, because of course during that period you want someone who's going to not, you know, want to come in and help you move. And what's quite, I guess, hard to confront in some of these issues is that you come across stories of burnings where queer people in Cornwall, when they reached a certain age and had to go into a care home, they put out adverts in the Outback asking for somebody to come out and help them queer their house before their families came in, so that they could hide their identities. And it's the fact that that had to happen, but also the fact that it's not documented, is something I think is really important, and that, you know, a big theme of the kind of inter-community support that happened. And I think it's also really interesting to think, you know, this is pre-internet, this is how the queer community organised and built a community is through grassroots newsletters like this. You know, it wasn't sold anywhere. It was very much who you knew would get you a copy, and then you'd be sent a slip in a brown paper envelope that no one would know what it is and things like that, and it would open it up and suddenly you had access to the queer community in Cornwall. And I think that's really important to highlight the support and the networks that were happening during this time. So something else that I think is really interesting in these Outback newsletters is, and also a tag is the identity. So you had lots of people writing in saying, you know, what does it mean to be a lesbian? What does it mean to feel what I'm feeling? And am I just missing female companionship? And I'm really struggling with X, Y, and Z. And I think that's really important to highlight and see that, you know, we still grapple with identity. We still grapple with who we are and definitions of what it means to be lesbian, what it means to be ace, what it means to be X, Y, and Z. And I think it's really, I guess, heartening to see that they were asking the same questions that we are now, and also to see how far we've come when you see there's a lot of There's a lot of kind of internalized sexism, lots of people, you know, grappling with, you know, femmes versus butch. The whole intersectionality of lesbian identity as well is talked about in these outlets, which is where you'd write in a letter and outlet what you're feeling, and you'd also then, you know, you can follow the conversations over over a couple of issues where people would write back and then they'd write back, and I think that's really fun to see that conversation documented down. So identity is another one of our points within queer history. And then I just wanted to highlight as well creativity. So queer creativity is also a theme. And I think that there's so much creativity in the queer community now and back then. You had a poetry section in every Outback magazine. Every single cover was illustrated by local artists. And you also had these really hilarious little cartoons at the bottom. I like the Penzance Art Club. First date you meet, second date you're getting a removal company, 6 months later you have 2 cats, and you know, it's gay humour doesn't change, which I think is really cool. Also reminds me of me and my wife, which also made me chuckle. So there's so much creativity in these pages, and I think that's also like a thread. I think queer people have always kind of driven to artistic endeavours, and I think that it's really lovely to see within Outback. So yeah, queer creativity is another one of our tags. And then one thing that I think is really quite forward thinking for the time is the Women's Land Trust that was set up by a group of queer women, and they owned a piece of land down by St Crede, which is in Penzance, so really right down on the tip of Cornwall. And they owned this land to rewild it, and they did amazing things there. They planted around 800 trees and then gave an update on the life of those trees over, you know, a year's issue. They ran events. It was a safe space where women could go and camp if they needed to escape from an abusive home, or just escape to have a day. They ran pottery workshops there, and foraging workshops, and the idea was it was a space for women. It was a space for especially queer women in Cornwall to go and be themselves and get in touch with nature. And I love that that's such the thread of environmentalism was really strong. Even back then, when we look with the kind of hindsight of climate, the climate emergency we're living through now, I think that it's incredibly inspiring to see what these women were doing to save the Cornish landscape, and also to use it in a way that supported their own community. So queer environmentalism is something that's really strong, which I didn't anticipate when I was predicting in that first meeting about what our tags would be and what I expected to find. I really didn't expect to find so much environmentalism, but I'm really pleased to see it. And then the last two themes that we've put in is national activism and local activism. And the reason I've split these is because it's so prevalent to see stories of metropolitan protests. It's something that is almost overtaken the narrative of queer history. You hear about Stonewall and you hear about Gay Liberation Front in London, but the reason I wanted to split national and local activism is because I think that it's really interesting to see what was happening in rural spaces during this time. And what I really loved about the national activism side is that not only did they have kind of updates on Section 28, updates on, like I said, like is shown, the Sainsbury's family donating to conversion therapy and things like that, is that they would organize bus trips. They would get in the bus and drive for 8 hours up to London from the end of Penzance and protest. And they were saying they bring the Cornish flag because their Cornish identity was, and their sense of Cornish independence was really strong. And that's really important to me as someone working in Cornwall, to show that queer history is Cornish history. So Cornish history has a very strong identity down here, but it's not that inclusive. I think when people perceive Cornish history, they think of the, you know, the bow maiden and the miner and the white kind of 2.5 family, you know, 2.5 children. And I love that there's this evidence of they're proud to be Cornish, they're proud of their kind of independent identity, but they also are taking that up to London to protest at Section 28, to protest outside the House of Lords when they threw out the lowering of the equal age of consent and things like that. And then it comes on to more local activism. And like I said, I think it's important that we kept this one separate, because I think it's significant to know what was happening locally, just because of the rural nature of Cornwall. So they did very specific political issues of the outback, where during local elections, they would interview each candidate, and obviously the Conservative candidate never took part, but the Green candidate did. And what's really interesting for Cornwall is that a lot of the Cornish independents took part and said, you know, all the questions were relating to what is your opinion on lowering the age of consent and getting rid of Section 28, and all these kind of important issues that were happening, but from a very, very local perspective, which I think is fascinating to keep, like I said, separate from national activism, but it's just as poignant. So those are the kind of key themes I was able to bring out of the Outback magazine collection. And so now I'm just going to talk a bit about what I've done in terms of outreach and sharing those stories with the community. So one thing that I did in January was I ran a queer zine workshop, and this was to tour the archive. It was to see the original documents of the Outback newsletter, and then to be inspired by those to create some kind of zine or a page from a zine of what would you put in an Outback if Outback was happening now. What would you put in? What would be your you know, would you write a letter about identity? Would you do something about environmentalism? I left it really up to the participants to choose what they would do. I supplied them with art materials and a lot of kind of collage materials, because I can't draw, but I love to do art, but I can't draw. So, you know, just being quite inclusive about different types. And it was really, really great as well to get this group. There were about 15, 20 of us into Kernow. And what was really interesting is at the very beginning, we asked how many people attending had been to Kernow before, and there were not that many, maybe 2 or 3 out of the group. So it's really opening up the archive to a brand new audience. And I also want to stress that I did this in partnership with Cornwall Pride. I had Matt, the CEO from Cornwall Pride, come along and help deliver the workshop and just share a bit about what Cornwall Pride's doing as well. And for me, that all links back to working together and sharing in the community. And, you know, the way we got participants for the workshop was through those links, through those Student Union Pride links and through Cornwall Pride, because I really wanted it to be targeted. I mean, the workshop was for anyone, but I really wanted it to be targeted to people in those spheres. So I didn't publicize it openly. I kind of publicized it through my networks of queer groups, because I really wanted to get that kind of queer response to the Outback newsletter. And I just wanted to show you here, these are some of the responses that were made during that art workshop. And one thing that I found really, really kind of touching, but also quite heartbreaking from the results of these, is that you see those same themes coming out again and again. Like I said before, you have themes of environmentalism, you've got themes of identity, you've got themes of support needed. So, you know, all these kind of issues that were represented in the Outback magazine, they were also represented in what people would put in a magazine now. And I felt like that was really kind of strong to see how the same issues come up again and again, no matter if it's, you know, 30 years later. So from that, what we did for February for History Month is we did a pop-up exhibition at Queer Kernow, and we did this in the foyer. And the reason we did it in the foyer and not the exhibition room is that we wanted it to be very low-key. We wanted it to, there's a cafe and a meeting space, so people who go into the archive don't necessarily go up to the library section, they don't go upstairs to the kind of very formal gallery section, but they might come in for a coffee, they might come in to just, you know, use the loo, for example. So by having it in the entranceway, it meant that everyone going past would have to go past this pop-up. And what we did, we had some of the outbacks open at these kind of thematic pages. And then next to it, we also had the work that the queer community in that workshop delivered. And I very surreptitiously kind of left the themes that matched up open, so you could see the threads of how it's still relevant today. And we also borrowed a lot of flags from Cornwall Pride, as you can see, just kind of jazz it up for History Month. And then I did a talk on queering the archives, and the reason why I put this in was to kind of talk about how I always try with my outreach to hit at many different levels. So I did a very targeted workshop for the queer community. Then I did a more academic style talk for mainly the heritage sector down here. And also, you know, we had participants who probably went to Queer Kernow's lecture series, but wouldn't have ever heard about Queer Kernow before. And then I say here still to go because it's a project that is still ongoing, and the next workshop that we'll be doing is actually with some of the artists and with some of the women who actually wrote the Outback newsletter. And I think it's fantastic that through our work, through using Cornwall Pride's kind of Facebook groups to get people to come along to the workshop and to promote what we're doing, promote the talk. That's how I was able to connect with these women. That's how they found out what was happening. And what was fantastic is that they were so touched that someone wanted to hear their story. So our next workshop is going to be a little bit like a memory cafe. It's going to be oral histories and cake. We're going to invite the women who wrote in the Outback and who have illustrated the Outback specifically to come along, bring anything down that they want to donate, because they wouldn't. As soon as I met them, they were wanting to give me everything they had, and I was just like, absolutely yes, let's have a big workshop where we, you know, you bring people you know who used to write, I'll bring the cake, and let's just have a chat. And then maybe we'll take your oral history, and then maybe we'll accession some of those things into the collection. And also from that, with that connection I have to Cornwall Pride, we're actually for Cornwall Pride this summer, because it is Pride 50 and it is also Pride 15 in Cornwall. We're doing our Pride kind of event guides to be in the style of the Outback, and we have actually got one of the women who used to illustrate the Outback magazines to agree to illustrate the front of the Cornwall Pride magazine for this year. And with that, we're moving Cornwall Pride to these pop-up events. So instead of having one big event, we're doing 11 pop-up events all over Cornwall, and one of them is going to be history themed, to learn about the history of LGBTQ plus Cornwall. And I'm so pleased that we'll be having an Outback presentation there and workshop to really open up the project to the rest of the queer community, really. So I'm going to stop sharing because that's the end of that. So yeah, that's kind of where I am with the project, and like I said, it's not finished. That's why I was like, this is what's coming, this is what we're doing. But I hope that's given you a bit of insight into what's happening in Cornwall, and how great Dan is actually for funding this project.
Thank you, Sophie. I really enjoyed your talk. I learned so much more about the project, and I think what you are doing is absolutely amazing. I first wanted to highlight something you said right at the beginning, where you said that the project seeks to kind of bridge the gap between heritage and community. And I think what I wanted to ask you is, because you spoke about how a lot of the research and the kind of archive work that you're doing is bringing up the kind of bringing to attention that pre-internet age and how queer people organised at that time and that inter-community support that they provided. So they had their switchboards and the kind of word of mouth. Oh, if you know someone, they can connect you with this person who will connect you to the wider group. And given that a lot of that research is researching that kind of grassroots approach to organising, do you see the project itself as kind of grassroots based, and is that kind of quite an important value that you kind of see yourselves as, or is it sort of different and you don't see yourselves as that way?
And no, I definitely see it as one of our core values, and I think it's important to us because there's a lot of threshold anxiety down here from the queer community into arts and heritage, and by just having that tiny bit of independence from them, it means that we've actually been able to work a lot closer with queer communities, with different groups, because there's that trust there. And I think because we're queer led and we're independent from this so-called kind of ivory tower mystique of you know, what can be perceived as the arts and heritage world, that it has been really useful to position ourselves as this kind of bridge between the two.
No, I find that interesting that you've described kind of arts and heritage as ivory tower, as a sort of ivory tower, because I think maybe I've always taken the approach where academia is the ivory tower, and actually things like arts and heritage are the kind of providing the outreach that people need. But actually, I think you've really highlighted that that's actually not the case if we think about it. And actually, that's really kind of made me reflect on how I perceive where everything stands with academia and kind of the research hubs that universities provide, but then also arts and culture and museums and heritage organisations, and how I always sort of saw it as, oh, well, they're the people who are actually kind of projecting that knowledge outwards. But yeah, that's made me think actually perhaps that, you know, there is an elitism and an inaccessibility in arts and culture that perhaps needs to be, well, not perhaps, needs to be acknowledged more, and how actually they can be really inaccessible for people. But how I really enjoyed what you said, where you said where you had given some talks where you were hitting different levels, where you had the academic level, but then you had the community level, and how maybe, and I would say that organisations like Hull Museums, with where Lauren was talking about the kind of the full package of things that they do, where they've got reading lists and podcasts and playlists and blogs and zine workshops, and how actually you're hitting a whole nother audience, and how actually the audiences, where if we see arts and heritage as the only way of espousing knowledge and kind of sharing knowledge, then actually again we are missing out on a whole demographic. So I really enjoy how you see yourselves as quite as being a grassroots movement, and that being integral to who you are, because that allows you to reach more people. I think that's really powerful and really important. And what we've been talking about the past couple of days is the dialogues between different facets of arts and culture and the kind of sectors, and how they all work with each other. Because, for instance, yesterday we heard from Orion Isaacs, who's a multidisciplinary artist, and we were talking about that quite strict binary between cultural organisations and artists, and how they're seen as external people, and how there might be a kind of level of, Orion described it as a level of mistrust between the two, and a kind of, but then we were sort of talking about ways where we could actually make that more of a collaborative partnership, where it was, what can I learn from you, but also what can you learn from me as an artist, and what can I bring to your organisation that will benefit it. So I think what we've really highlighted these past couple of days is that perhaps we have these kind of false binaries between, you know, the academy and arts and heritage organisations and grassroots activist organisations and external or freelance individuals, whether they're sort of artists or performers or creatives, and how we can facilitate conversations between all of these different facets, and we can work together to work better, if that makes sense, and to give everyone a better experience. So I've been really you've given a really valuable contribution to that discussion as well, so thank you for that. And I guess I'd also say, do you see the project as having a kind of political stance and a kind of activist? Would you say that activism is part of what you do, and how does that fit into the work that you do with heritage? Because I think sometimes there is a perception of, well, we can't say this is political because we're going to rile up the wrong people, if that makes sense. And there's a kind of trying to, quell voices which might say, oh, I'm not coming to see activism, I want to see, how would you approach that kind of that tension that sometimes arises when we're talking about queer narratives, because of course the person is political, and we know that, but what's your take on that, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, so I have, because I worked within a museum for about 6 years, a county museum, so I was very aware when I started doing queer research there that it was a very political statement. The museum lost members when we went to Pride. There was, it was even discussed of whether it should be an AGM amendment and a vote of whether we should go to Pride as an organisation and things like that. So I guess that, and I'm sure you find this, that by just existing, you're political. So what I like about Queer Kernow is it allows me to be as open as I want without having to consider the kind of PR stances of museums.
Yes,
and I kind of say to museums when I'm working with them as well, I was like, well, we're the ones doing that bit. So, I'm fully happy if you want to say, oh, well, it's not us, it's Queer Kernow that are the activists here, the museum is just facilitating this. And I'm like, if the end result is the project gets done, then the project gets done, and your museum is taking a step in the right direction. And also it's about empowering the people within the organisation. So a lot of people that I've worked with down here, like Crescent Kernow, they wanted to do an LGBTQ plus collections guide, but they didn't know how. They needed that support to do it, and they needed someone to go in and be like, we're saying it's okay, and we've got your backs if there's flack. And I think that that's really important, that a lot of times, especially in Cornwall, where we have very rurally isolated areas and museums, that having just someone that's got your back that can be a bit more ballsy than you because you're outside the organisation.
Yes, yeah.
You can kind of bring them along for the journey then.
No, you're right. Well, I think that's probably very convenient and makes things easy for the organisation to sort of, push those voices onto you, perhaps, and that you can sort of, you can be a buffer and say, okay, well, fine, blame us, and and I guess you have enough confidence behind what you're doing that that sort of it's okay, contrary to sort of some loud voices, some loud dissent. So I think that's very good. And I think the final thing I will highlight before we wrap up is I really like how you've taken a decentralized approach to Pride and perhaps to the rest of the project more generally, and how that actually reflects the landscape and the geography that you're working in. I think that's very clever and also will benefit much more, many more people. Could you talk just finally a bit about Pride and how you've got it all in separate locations, and what was your thinking, what was your approach, and why do you think that's beneficial for Cornwall?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the last kind of 5 years, Cornwall Pride's run one big Pride in Newquay, which is the kind of traditional Pride, but it's also run a bus tour where for a weekend, this one bus will go around visiting all the small towns that get left behind and have a pop-up Pride for 3-4 hours, and then it'll move on to the next one. And what we were finding from our kind of responses was that actually a lot more of the real work of connecting with the community and finding, you know, connecting people with charities for support and things like that was actually happening on the bus tour rather than in the one big Newquay Pride, because I'm sure that this is something that everyone on here will understand or has been sensitive to, is that Pride is turning a corner about its values and its where it sits. And we had a real fear that because our Pride is in Newquay and it's right by the beach and it was in August bank holiday, that how many people attending were actually Cornish and how many people were actually just there on holiday wanting to have that kind of drinking culture experience by a beach for Pride. So it was about taking Pride back to the communities and thinking, okay, well, we've done this bus tour, so let's capitalize on that. And that worked. So what we're doing is we're doing 11 Prides over the summer, every single Saturday throughout the whole summer. And they're going to be, it's pretty much the same setup. There's going to be 15 stalls, a stage, acts throughout it. But what's going to be different is each one is going to be in a different place and each one is going to have a different theme. So the themes were chosen by the community down here in Cornwall, and it's things that we're passionate about. So, you know, we've got a climate action Pride that's happening in St Ives on the beach, we're doing with Extinction Rebellion. We've got a Celtic Pride to celebrate the Cornish identity in Redruth, which is a really kind of industrial mining town. We've got alternative Pride happening in Penzance, because that's where you find lots of alternative kind of weird artistic fun things happening. I myself, I'm really involved in running the History Pride, which is about getting museums and galleries together in Truro, which is our city, to share about, you know, 50 years. And I think it's really important that each Pride has a theme so that you can kind of dip in and out. So I'm not going to go to the Sports Pride because, my God, I can't do sports to save my life. But, you know, I'm really excited to go to the Celtic Pride and to, the climate change and the Trans Pride. So, and it's also acknowledging the different intersectionalities of the community down here. So, you know, we're working really closely with Black Voices Cornwall to have an intersectional Pride as well. And we're having that in a town which has actually faced a great deal of abuse. And that's the reason why we're having it there, because it's the most needed. And that's another thing that came out of the bus tour was, you know, you go to the kind of bigger, more touristy places and it's fine, but then you hit some more of the rural places like Bodmin, which is quite an impoverished area of North Cornwall. And, you know, some of the drag queens there last year just didn't feel safe. And it was really important to us to be like, right, well, we need to take Pride to where it's needed most and where we're going to make the most difference. So I'm really excited about Pride this year. I think it's going to be great. If anyone is wanting to come to Cornwall, then next week we'll be announcing all the different locations and themes, and it's going to be fantastic, way more community focused, and yeah, it's going to be good.
It sounds amazing. I'm in awe. I'm sort of here. I just don't really know what to say. It sounds incredible. I mean, when I have to say, when I do hear the words queer and bus, I think of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. It happens. It sounds phenomenal. And we've got a comment here from Matty saying, I'm so uplifted hearing about your work, Sophie. I was not in queer spaces or museum spaces when I was living in Cornwall, but if I'd seen Queer Kernow,
there you go,
got there in the end, then it would have had a huge impact. That must be so wonderful to sort of hear.
Yeah, thank you, Matty. That's exactly why I do the work I do, because you know, I think it's also important to state there isn't a queer space in Cornwall. We don't have a LGBTQ bar. We don't have a meeting space. Cornwall Pride doesn't have an office. You know, it's all very esoteric in that sense. So, it's kind of why we do what we do, is that, you know, we need to show that there are safe queer spaces to go to.
That is so wonderful to hear. And I will close with a closing statement from Matty, who has said, we'll definitely look into coming back to Cornwall this summer. Would love to coincide with Trans Pride. That is just wonderful to sort of see the reach of your work. Thank you so much, Sophie. As I have said, this has been such a valuable contribution to the symposium, and it's been really wonderful having you. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to to share what's happening in Cornwall on a wider scale.